You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Weekly Wine Report. The goal of this segment is to share a mix of news, history, and stories from around the world of wine to help give you more perspective, spark curiosity, and help you discover something new in wine. I am your host, Billy Galanko, and today we have two very big stories in the world of wine. We're going to dive into the news and then dig in a little bit more into why each of these pieces of news, what it means for the wines. First, we start in Bordeaux, where Château Lafleur has announced that it will be leaving the Bordeaux appellation system. It will be reclassifying all 6 of its wines as Vin de France, starting with the 2025 vintage. So moving forward, each of these wines will be classified as Vin de France, rather than even just AOC Bordeaux or Pomerol, for example, for Château Lafleur. And the reasons that the family cited were accelerating climate change, restrictive AOC regulations, and just a need for greater flexibility to produce the best wines they think they can moving forward. Now, what's interesting about this is that Château Lafleur obviously is one of Bordeaux's top wine estates. It's up there with just behind Petrus in many people's minds. It's up there with the first growth in terms of caliber of wine. It certainly commands really high prices in terms of the wine. It's really big news, and I wanted to give a little bit more detail into what they might be referring to in terms of restrictive regulations for the AOC. And what's interesting is this year in particular, Bordeaux's vintage has been really hot. Chateau Tremblant-Mondot started picking their red grapes on August 28th, which is the earliest in history, even earlier than in 2022, which saw some historically early picking dates. So it's just this hot, dry growing season that really has people thinking about what do they need to do to maximize the quality in their wines and how can they keep their vines healthy moving forward. And I was digging around a few of the AOC restrictions for both Pomerol and Bordeaux as a whole. So if you're going to have a bottle that's labeled Pomerol AOC on it, so Château Lafleur, Pomerol is right on the label, it has to be a red wine. There's no white wine allowed to be made under the Pomerol AOC. And the only grapes that are allowed are Merlot, Cab Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Malbec, and Petit Verdot. Those are the varieties that are allowed, where in the rest of Bordeaux, they allow all of those varieties, but then they also allow some experimental ones like Marselan, Riga Nacional, and they also offer the ability to include white grapes. Something that I didn't really realize is Pomerol just started allowing Petit Verdot in the last 20 years or so, I believe, which is interesting because that's one of the OG Bordeaux varieties that have been allowed in the region for a long time. So that's demonstrating how if a traditional Bordeaux variety was just let into the Pomerol AOC not too long ago, showing how slow some of these gears and mechanisms in the AOC themselves move. Moving down, there is a planting density, a minimum of 5,500 vines per hectare, which is not exceedingly high, but at the same time, not being able to spread out your vines if you did want to have a test plot of really low density is something that would be pretty restrictive. When you spread out the vines a little bit more, it gives each one more space to absorb more water in the ground, which could help moving forward with hotter temperatures, lower rainfall. And it's something that, Lafleur might want to explore. So that restriction itself is something they might want to consider. Bordeaux, the minimum vine density is 4,000 vines per hectare. So Pomerol is 1,500 vines higher. But that said, many of the Pomerol producers probably have much higher planting densities than that. You probably will see around 8,000 or 10,000 in some producers. So that's not a crazy high minimum, but it's just something that they can't go below even if they wanted to. The other element is the max hectoliters per hectare. The max yield you can get out of the vineyard is 49 for Pomerol, whereas for the rest of Bordeaux, it's 60. There are some extenuating circumstances, I believe, that allow Pomerol to reach that 60 hectoliters per hectare mark. But again, that is a certain restriction that, is relatively low in the grand scheme of wine. Just only 49 hectoliters per hectare. So it's something that Lafleur may want to experiment, maybe having some sort of picking earlier and having higher volume per hectare and maybe a fresher wine. That's something something to consider. Maybe you're not just going for these low yielding, dense wines as the temperature and rainfall continue to change. And then they go on and on. There's a minimum of at least 12% alcohol, which is interesting, is that the AOC rules have a minimum of alcohol. This is back in the day when you were trying to get the grapes ripe enough to reach a certain level. Today, the grapes are getting more ripe than they would like. And then there's also additional rules around how long a wine has to be aged before it can be released and things like that. What is interesting to me is this comes on the heels not too long ago of Cheval Blanc and Angelus leaving the Saint-Emilion classification system, which again also had its own rules, but they weren't leaving the Saint-Emilion appellation. So this is a big step going all the way to Vin de France. They're up there with Liber Pater, who also uses varieties that Bordeaux doesn't allow, so they're also labeled Vin de France. And it's just something that is really showing how people are considering what they're going to be doing to handle making the wines that they want to moving forward. And it may not be writing the brand name of Bordeaux. It might be writing the power of the Chateau. So the second topic that I want to cover on goes across the pond. We go all the way over to California, and I want to highlight a fire in Napa Valley. I don't know if everybody is aware of that. It's at the far end of the valley, away from the bay. So it's close to Calistoga. It's called the Pickett Fire. The Pickett Fire so far has caused $65 million in vineyard damage, damaging roughly 3% of this year's grape harvest. That's total Napa grape harvest. And when they say damage, that could be heat-related, direct, not necessarily burning of the vines, because vines tend to be a pretty good fire break, and not necessarily light on fire because they're full of water. But it could be heat damage, and it can also be smoke. Smoke is the most common damage. I wanted to share how and why smoke impacts wines and why it's particularly tough to deal with. But before we get into the smoke part, the Pickett Fire, it's in the same general area as the Glass Fire was in 2020, but it's much more under control. Everybody is really complimenting the firefighting efforts that have been going on there. They were able to pour a lot of resources in very quickly, and the fire is being handled very well. But the drama around it at this point seems to be around how did it start? It appears that it may have started either on or near a vineyard owned by 100 Acre, which is owned by Jason Woodbridge, the 100 Acre wine company, that is. There were some rumors originally that it may have been a controlled burn gone wrong. The current working theory is that it was from a contractor worker who was dumping out ashes that he thought to be completely out, and they somehow led to a spark and a fire. I'm really curious about that one. What I've read so far was ashes from an oven. I don't know who's just using a wood-burning oven these days, but would be really interested to learn more about where those ashes started from. But either way, Jason Woodbridge, after the 2020 Glass Fire, has been caught up in some wrangling with Napa County and talking about the replanting of the area. He planted an experimental vineyard in a certain area without permits. This vineyard that Jason Woodbridge had planted wasn't technically in compliance with all of the current Napa rules for replanting and fire breaks and such. And they've been litigating the case for a couple of years now. We don't know for sure where it started or how, but we know Jason Woodbridge and the 100 Acre team have been battling to keep their vines and wineries safe. So for them and for everybody, I hope the grapes and wines are protected as much as possible. So just stay tuned there. But let's talk about now what could happen if smoke did reach some of these grapes as they are getting ready to be picked in the coming weeks. Smoke taint occurs when compounds from a fire are absorbed by the grapes. And typically it's the grape skins. These are volatile phenols. One of the most famous ones you'll hear in the wine industry is guaiacol, which is like a campfire smoky essence. There's also methyl guaiacol, which is more ashy than the pure campfire. You may also hear people talking about cresols with a tar, burnt plastic kind of smell. And then there's a few other ones. And what's interesting with these is they get absorbed into the grape skins. So wines that are made with their skins, like a red wine, that is where the kind of these compounds would be extracted from. So white wines tend to be a little bit more immune from the impacts of smoke as they're immediately removed from the skin. So they tend to be a little less impacted. But red wines, they will be made with their skins. And as the solutions extract the color and the anthocyanins and all of the great things that you want from the skins to make a red wine high quality, especially a Napa Cab, it will extract some of these other volatile phenols. And what's tricky is when you're just tasting the grapes and tasting the grape skins, you can't pick up that smoky taste. Like the grapes aren't going to taste smoky. There are some tests that you can do. You can crush the grapes and put them through a chemical test to see if they're showing any of these compounds. But what's really tough about them is some of them don't really get released and they're not really perceptible until after the alcoholic fermentation. And it's during that process where they become volatilized and these compounds come out. So you don't know until after you've made the wine if it's going to be smoky or tainted in any way. Some people do small ferments and little tests just to tell, but it's really tough. And then they can also continue to evolve in the bottle, and it can actually even continue in people's mouths. Like sometimes these compounds aren't volatilized until it hits the saliva in your mouth. So it's a really tricky thing to deal with. I think we mentioned this a while back, but for certain vineyards in certain areas, depending on your insurance provider, you can file an insurance claim if you lose the crop due to smoke. But what you can't do then is use those grapes for anything else. So it's not like you can it either has to be a total loss or not be able to file for insurance claims, at least in a lot of the cases that I've spoken with producers about. So with stuff there is you can't say some of these grapes are good, some of these are bad. You have to just make a decision one way or another, which is very tough. But some ways that people have been dealing with it, maybe there's just one little block has some smoke taint, or you're trying to extract a little bit, you're concerned about it. Some people use activated carbon or reverse osmosis or nanofilters. Sometimes enzymes can also help, but the main way is just a lot of people do is just these small scale ferments and see if they get any of these compounds expressing themselves before they try to do a larger ferment with all of the grapes. So it's tricky. It's a really interesting issue. It also depends too on the grape varieties sometimes as well. So there's a lot of different things that can impact how the smoke presents itself and how much is absorbed. All right. I hope everybody learned a little bit more about the Bordeaux AOC system and smoke taint. The goal with this first wine report is to, one, make everybody aware of these big happenings in the news. Again, these won't always be news. We'll talk about history. We'll sometimes do a deep dive into a grape variety or a region. But these were two really big news stories in the wine world that I couldn't pass up talking about. And the reasons you have to dig a little bit deeper behind the news. It's not just a decision of one chateau. This is the building up of rules that have been in place and the lack of evolution in Bordeaux for a while. And it might be something that spurs on broader change across the whole region, if not just Pomerol itself. And then smoke taint is something to consider. It's not just, is it smoky, is it not smoky? It's quite an interesting rabbit hole to go down. So I hope everybody enjoyed this inaugural episode of the weekly wine report. We'll be back with another wine report next week. In the meantime, we'll have our regular episodes coming out on Wednesday and another 5 questions on Friday. So until Wednesday, cheers.